Welcome to this special indoor edition of The Naturalist, where I talk all about antlers. Let's go. Well, here it is, mid-February 2025, and we reached a point in this season that's important for deer, male deer in particular, and this is when they shed their antlers for the year. And of course, they'll start to grow those back come April and May. And so I thought, it's kind of crappy weather outside. I thought I'd do a little indoor presentation today about antlers. Antlers that I've collected through the years. I'm coming to you from Hocking County, and my property there of 9 acres, which is frequented by deer, believe you me. So I thought I would show you a little bit about and talk a little bit about deer antlers today, based on the items that I have harvested or collected. I'm going to start our discussions today by looking at this rack. This rack comes from a buck that was probably about three years old or so when it was harvested. And let's just point out the parts and how this came to be on this rack to start. So first of all, the antlers originate from these points on the skull. They grow throughout the course of about 4 months, from April or May till the start of September, typically. Okay, so all this is grown in well less than 1 year, in about 4 months. These are what we would call the main beams, and these are the tines. These would be the brow tines, and these are the tines of the main rack. Okay, this buck is basically what you would call a 9-pointer, because it has 9 points on the rack, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this rack is quite symmetrical, other than the fact that this tine right here has no match on this side. So if it had a match, this would be a perfect 10-pointer. You see how polished the rack is, and that happens in the fall. As these antlers are growing, starting in the spring, they're covered by a tissue commonly called velvet, which is rich in a blood supply that feeds and fuels the growth of these antlers throughout the season. By around the start of September, the antlers have completed growing, and the buck will rub off that velvet by rubbing its antlers on trees and shrubs and so forth, basically shedding that velvet little by little and polishing the antlers at the same time. Now that process serves several purposes. 1, to get rid of the velvet, but 2, to reveal the rack, which is an important visual signal in the reproductive behavior of deer, of white-tailed deer. Simply put, the bucks with the larger racks tend to get more mates. Okay, the larger deer with the larger racks get more mates. On this property here in Hocking County, where I currently am located, I have a trail cam, and on that trail cam, I often see bucks interacting on that cam. And I've seen many bucks on that cam with much larger racks than this. And often, you'll see the two engaging in a battle, and the larger buck usually drives off the smaller buck. It's pretty obvious to see on camera. Okay? So this rack would be what you would call a typical rack. And that is, it has the very typical appearance of a white-tailed deer buck. There are non-typical racks, and those would be racks that have tines that in some cases might point downward, or have a club-like appearance, or a palmated appearance, more like a moose. Anything that doesn't look like this, you would call a non-typical rack. And in the buck world, there's a scoring system for racks that basically is a sum of a number of measurements that you take on the rack, including the diameter of the main beams, the length of the beam, the length of the tines, the distance between the antlers and between the points in the front of the main beam, And so there's a separate scoring system for typical bucks like this than there is for non-typical bucks. Non-typical bucks can sometimes have 30 or 40 points on the rack. Okay, so it's not quite fair to compare them to a typical rack. All right, so nonetheless, this is again, a fairly young buck that was harvested this year. Okay, now as I mentioned, this is an important time in the yearly cycle of bucks because they start to shed their antlers. So here's a shed antler that I collected from this property. And as you can see, again, it's a typical buck. This one is larger though, okay? Has a thicker main beam. The tines are longer. Now, if this one had a matching antler on the other side, this would be an 8-point. So this buck is likely older than the buck I just showed you, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will have more points, but it does have a larger rack. The number of points usually does increase with age up to a point, and then, but not always. Okay, so you can have very large bucks that are only 8 points like this. All right, now just about age, bucks also generally grow a larger rack as they age up to a point. Very old bucks start then to produce smaller and smaller racks as they age, just because of the wears and tears of aging. They can't do the same thing they can do when they're 4, 5, and 6 years old. When they're approaching 10 years old. All right. So the size of the antlers rises and falls again. So this was a shed, and you can see it's shed right here where at that attachment to the skull. Okay, and this is a good time of the year to look around in the woods for shed antlers. Shed hunting is kind of a pretty popular activity. All right, the next rack I'm going to show you was prepared in a form that's known as a European mount, okay, where the skull is still attached to the antlers. Okay, it's called a European mount because this way of displaying antlers was common in Europe, right? Here in North America, people will tend to mount either the whole head or a skull plate that might be covered with either fur or felt, okay, in a small plate. But nonetheless, this is a European mount. This buck was harvested about 10 years ago, and it's a 10-point. Relative to the first buck I showed you, this buck is probably a year or two older, based on its size, okay, and the thickness of the main beams. Well, I've had a change of venue and a change of racks, but I'm going to continue our discussion from a new location at home. And as I was talking, I was introduced the European mount, and so I have another European mount here to show you. We'll continue our presentation on this one. So this one was a deer taking, about 11, 12 years ago, and this is an 8-point. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And again, prepared in that European mount style. So just a couple things I wanted to point out to you in the European mount with the skull present is I've been talking about the ages of these deer. One thing you can do is age a deer by its teeth. So usually you use the lower jaw. I don't have the lower jaw of this deer here, but you can use upper teeth as well. Okay, so these are the upper teeth of a white-tailed deer. There are 6 teeth, 3 premolars and 3 molars. And there are no upper front teeth, by the way. Okay, all that white-tailed deer have is a hard pad in their upper jaw that their lower incisors press up against to nip off buds and twigs. So white-tailed deer have no upper teeth. So if you ever see a little cartoon of a deer with upper teeth, you know it's biologically incorrect. Okay, now if you look closely at those teeth, you can see that they have ridges and cusps and things like that. And there are different sort of lines you can see inside the teeth that distinguish the dentine from the cementum and things like that. But you can use these features of deer to age a deer. Okay, for example, how worn those teeth are. If they're very worn and hollowed out, you know you have an older deer. You can actually do a cross-section of these teeth. And the cementum is laid down in rings, much like tree rings. And so you can use the rings that you can count in the teeth to age a deer. It's not necessarily perfect, but you can do it. You can get pretty close to the age of a deer by just examining its teeth. And again, teeth wear occurs because of deer are eating a lot of fibrous, hard, woody material, and they have to grind it in their molars before they swallow, and so that process just wears down these what start out as relatively sharp teeth through time. And so you can again look at teeth to age deer. All right. Now, a couple other things you can see on this deer. Of course, these are the eye sockets where the eyes would be. The brain case is inside that hole right there. You can see sutures in the skull where the skull plates join each other. Okay, the various parts of the skull are connected, knitted together. All right, so again, a European mount, 8-point, harvested 12 years ago. Okay, and then the last, there's one other little anomaly on a couple of these racks to show you too that illustrates some of the varied things you can see. Like most of this rack looks like a typical, pretty much very symmetrical, typical rack. Okay, but this one actually has a hole in the antler right here. And it's not totally clear why that hole is there, whether it was just some genetic mutation that led to that, or there was an injury to this deer as those antlers were growing. It's completely healed. It almost looks like, it was shot there, frankly, but I don't believe that's what happened. So it's just kind of an interesting little anomaly you can see there on this antler is that hole in the rack. Okay. All right, the last rack that I'll show you today is this. Okay, this is one harvested about 8 years ago, and I think was the largest rack taken from my property in Hocking County. And again, this one shows several anomalies as well. This is a typical rack, but it does have a few features that make it a little less typical, okay? First of all, this is a 9-point, right? So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But this one is verging on being a 10-point. So this little point right here, this tine, it's going to be a tine. Probably it would have been next year, but it didn't quite qualify as a tine in terms of the measuring system for antlers that I described earlier. Okay, so it's on its way to being a 10-point, but not quite. There's just a little bump there. Okay, another little anomaly on this rack is how this tine is bent. All right, if you look at its matching tine on this side, it's pretty much perfectly straight, right? And so that tine has a real noticeable bend to it. That makes it a little bit different. And then the brow tine here, this one has kind of a curve to it, but it's still rounded and pointy. This one is blade shaped. It's really interesting. It almost looks like a knife blade. Okay, if you take a look at that one, it's shaped a lot like a blade. So that's a little bit of an anomalous tine as well. But otherwise, this is the largest of the racks that I've collected from my property. I mentioned the measuring system. Again, that is a summary, a summation of a number of measurements you take on the rack. This rack measured about 120 in that measuring system. That's not really considered a trophy by most people. People don't really think of trophy bucks until they might hit 150 or so. I mean, that's all subjective, of course. This first buck that I measured or showed you measures about an 80 on that scoring system. Okay, it only has 8 points. The tines are shorter. They're smaller in diameter than the buck I just showed you. Okay, so overall, this buck is at least a year, maybe 2 years younger than the one I just showed you, and would score lower on that standard scoring system. If I hadn't mentioned it, bucks, as I did mention, bucks, their antlers grow each year larger and larger to a point and then decline. In a buck's first year, a yearling buck, if you see it in the fall, it may look no different than the female deer. You may not see anything necessarily on its head. The most you might see are little buttons. Okay, we often call a yearling buck with little antler buds a button buck. Okay, that are just sometimes they don't even come the whole way out of the fur. They're still sort of covered by fur. They're more or less bumps. And that's their first year, a yearling. By the second year, the antlers of the deer might have, say, 2 points on each side, maybe 3 on each side if it grew fast. Sometimes just single tines arise from the skull. You call that a spike buck. By year 3 and 4, then you start to get bucks that look like this with 6 or 8 points. Of course, 10, 12-point bucks are usually a year older or so. So that's basically the progression of antlers. These things look big and heavy, and they can be, but they're not really as heavy as you might think. So you see a large buck with a big rack out there and you think, how the heck does that thing hold its head up? They're actually not that heavy, all right, if you were to feel these things. Some of you might have done that before. But imagine an elk or a moose with antlers that are 10 times the size of these things, and thicker. Those now get up to be particularly, heavy, a burden for a large, buck to carry. But of course, though elk and moose are much larger animals than a white-tailed deer. Just in terms of the deer themselves, these bucks probably weighed between 150 and 180 pounds. A large buck can be 250, maybe pushing 300 at the largest. Those are really large bucks to be of that size for white-tailed deer. Elk and moose can be 800, 900, 1,200 pounds. Okay, so they're much larger animals altogether. So even though their racks look big and heavy and burdensome, they're large animals. They can bear that burden pretty well. So here we are again in mid-February, where bucks out there right now are losing these antlers if they haven't lost them already. And then there'll be a little bit of a rest period here for the next 2 to 3 months until April or May. And by May, mid-May, I'd say, or late May, you'll start to see the antlers growing again from bucks. And they'll be covered with velvet, as I mentioned, usually a brownish material. And they're not pointy usually at that point either. They're blunt, so they'll be knobby looking as they come out of their skull. And it's a really interesting process. The development of antlers is fascinating. Their purpose is interesting, and their appearance is they're kind of like a little bit of nature's artwork. Every rack has some similarities yet differences, and each one is a kind of a unique piece of art. So that's what I have to tell you today about the antlers of white-tailed deer. And I guess I'll join you next time, and I'm going to do a bonsai episode next time, so stay tuned. All right, take care. Bye-bye. you.